Hello, everyone. Welcome to the CG webinar. And I think it's 402, isn't it, Chris?
Yes, it is.
402. That's counting both our webinars and our seminars going back to the beginning of CG and the end of 2015. But I think most of those numbers are from the webinar series, which began during the pandemic in the first month of the pandemic in 2020. So we've chalked up more than 300 webinars, we think. We should do a proper calculation. Today, we've got Rob Kaisers with us, and he's going to talk about life course trajectories and wealth accumulation in the United States, comparing late baby boomers and early millennials. Pretty interesting topic. I think a lot of us were drawn to the description of the topic in the webinar website. But before I introduce Rob properly, let me take you through the housekeeping protocols. Remember, the webinar is being recorded and will be on our YouTube channel, and you can access that through our website in the next 24, 48 hours or so. During the webinar, we advise you to keep muted. Don't have your microphone on until you come into the Q&A part of the webinar and speak then. Extraneous noise does interfere with the presentation. Well, you don't need to have your camera on either, but we do advise you to turn both your camera and particularly your microphone on when you enter the Q&A. Now, to take part in our discussion, which is an important part of the webinar and starts more or less halfway through the process, halfway through the hour, use the chat function. Post your question or your statement about the topic in the chat, and then I'll arrange the speaking list accordingly. We do that to make sure that those who come into the discussion are actually on the topic of the webinar and not trying to sell us a product or something like that. Once I've identified you for this Q&A, I'll send you a little message in the chat, private message saying I'm going to call you in now or soon. And when you are called in to come onto camera, turn on your mic and your camera, and then tell us who you are and where you are from, and then give us your statement or your question for Rob. Now, Rob Kaisers, well, Associate Professor in Education at the School of Education at the University of Bristol, a very strong education school in the UK. His primary research interests are in the fields of social stratification, his topic today, life course research and comparative education with a focus on low and middle income countries in the global south. His current research focuses on inequality in learning outcomes in relation to school segregation and the growth of private schooling in the global south. Well, that's certainly a rich topic. And I notice already we have a couple of experts on that topic with us in this webinar. A second strand of Rob's research is looking at young adult life courses in the context of socioeconomic precarity and returns to education and the problem of youth unemployment. So, Rob, the screen is now yours.
Thanks, Simon, for that introduction. Let me just start by sharing my screen. So I need to choose that one there, and then full screen. And okay, so you should all be able to see the full screen now. Is that correct?
We can. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. So, yeah, so the paper I'm presenting today is joint work with Zachary van Winkel, who is at Sciences Po in Paris, and Annette Fazang, who is a professor at the Humboldt University in Berlin. My name is Rob Kaisers. I wrote this study mostly while I was in Cambridge. It's been a very long process. It's been about 5 years from when we had the initial idea to when it was published, which was late last year. In the meantime, I've switched to Bristol, so I'm now working as an associate professor in Bristol since the beginning of this month. Yeah, so the paper deals with a question that is of quite broad current interest. So this idea of which generation is worse off? Our generation, are millennials really doing worse off than their parents' generation, the baby boomers, which is something that often comes up, right, in the media and in social media and also in people's private conversations. There is this sort of general idea that millennials are in a difficult situation economically, whereas baby boomers, when they were younger, they had it much easier. And there's various reasons for that, and a lot of them relate to their sort of precarious employment opportunities, but also maybe more turbulent family lives. But so there is that strong narrative, but then more recently, there's also been people who've been challenging that, right? So John Twenge is an American scholar who wrote a book and some blogs arguing that actually millennials are doing pretty well when we look at the most recent data. So it's a little bit of an open question that our study seeks to address using very detailed empirical data from the United States. So like I said, the study was published late last year in the American Journal of Sociology. I think it's probably not open access, but if you cannot get access to the paper, please do send me an email and I'll happy to send you the PDF. The paper addresses 4 main questions. So first, we look at the distribution of household wealth at age 35 and how that differs between millennials and baby boomers. So millennials obviously were 35 around now, maybe the last couple of years, depending on their exact birth year. Baby boomers were 35 somewhere around the early 1990s. Then secondly, we look at the early work and family trajectories of each cohort and how they differ. So how do people's typical work and family trajectories vary? And then thirdly, we look at how the wealth returns to different work and family trajectories vary, again, between the 2 cohorts. So which trajectories are associated with wealth and how does that differ between millennials and baby boomers? And then finally, if we, to the extent that we observe cohort differences in wealth, to what extent can they be attributed to changes in these typical work and family trajectories or life courses? So we are very much positioning this study in the life course paradigm. So we are taking a life course approach to explaining differences in wealth across birth cohorts. And specifically, we refer to 3 core principles of the life course research paradigms, which is on the one hand, comparing birth cohorts at the same age as a way of studying social change. Paying attention to intra-cohort differentiation and inequality rather than looking at averages by generation. So especially when it comes to a variable like wealth, which is highly unequally distributed, looking at the average or the mean can actually be very misleading, right? If you think about, let's say myself and Mark Zuckerberg, we are both millennials, right? And if you take our average wealth, we are obviously very wealthy on average, but that doesn't tell you very much about my wealth or Mark Zuckerberg's wealth, simply because he is such an outlier, right? So the problem with variables like wealth is that the average is very, very much affected by outliers, and that's why we look at inter-cohort differentiation, and we use a method called quantile regression, which I'll go into in a minute. And a third principle of the life course paradigm is looking at life courses as longitudinal sequence trajectories. So we don't observe people at a single point in time. We look at how their lives play out over time as they age. And then we link those life courses, as I mentioned, to wealth accumulation. And so why might we expect that life course trajectories are associated with wealth accumulation? So we identify 4 theoretical mechanisms. So the first mechanism is the treatment effect. So the direct wealth enhancing effect of work and family life courses. So a typical example would be, now, if you have a highly paid job that enables you to save money, and as a result of that, your wealth increases. But you could also think of a family trajectory that's characterized by divorce, which can be quite costly. So that would be typical examples of treatment mechanisms. But then there's also facilitation mechanisms, which happens when wealth enables certain life course transitions or provide access to certain trajectories, or inversely, when certain pathways are blocked or complicated by a lack of wealth. So a typical example could be that wealth might enable you for example, to do advanced study, especially in the US, where higher education is quite expensive. Whereas on the other hand, a lack of wealth or a lack of parental wealth might prevent you from doing so. Then the third theoretical mechanism is selection of people into different work and family trajectories, for example, by parental socioeconomic status or by class or gender, which might affect the returns to those trajectories. So rather than the trajectories themselves affecting wealth, there could be a selection effect where people who are maybe more predisposition to being wealthy, for example, because they have wealthy parents, are more likely to engage in certain work or family trajectories. And then the fourth mechanism is what we call discrimination, which is when third parties like employers or parents or others exhibit bias against or in favor of certain life course trajectories in ways that are relevant to wealth accumulation. So you can think here, for example, about things like the motherhood wage penalty, but also things like assortative mating based on wealth. So two things that are important to mention here. One is that empirically, we are unable to distinguish between these four processes. So we cannot tell which of the mechanisms are actually in place. We can only observe an association between life course trajectories on the one hand and wealth on the other hand. And the second thing to mention is that that association is not necessarily a causal association, because like we said, the association is probably partially causal because there's these treatment mechanisms at play, but there's also selection, and which is obviously not a causal mechanism. So those are two things that are important to keep in mind as we look at the results. Yeah, so why might we expect to see differences in wealth between baby boomers and millennials at the same age in relation to those trajectories? So basically, there's two main reasons here. So one could be that there's a difference in the prevalence of certain trajectories that are associated with either high or low wealth accumulation in each cohort. So it could be that certain trajectories become less common or more common. For example, a decline in marriage or an increase in unstable, low-paid employment among millennials. We might expect that to result in a lower wealth accumulation for that cohort. But it might also be that the returns that are associated with otherwise similar trajectories differ, so that we have the same trajectory in each cohort, but in one cohort, it might be associated with higher levels of wealth. So for example, it could be that the wealth holdings of married couples with stable working class careers are different among baby boomers and among millennials. So those are things that we can look at and that we will look at in our paper. And then it's important to keep in mind the changing, let's say, macroeconomic, macrostructural context that might affect how wealth outcomes play out across these two cohorts. So over the past couple of decades, which is the time in which when baby boomers came of age versus when the millennials came of age, we have seen economic restructuring in the US. So we've seen widespread deindustrialization and the offshoring of manufacturing jobs. We have seen what economists call skill-biased technological change, where there is an increase in jobs both at the lower end of the wage distribution as well as at the higher end. And that rise in the higher end has often to do with the rise of the service economy. So care jobs, service jobs have increased, whereas manufacturing jobs have declined. We also see a cultural change, including change in people's family values and norms, and what is broadly known as the second demographic transition amongst demographers. And that involves an overall decline in marriage rates, overall delay in the age at first birth, as well as overall fertility, and an increase in separation and family complexity. So that obviously affects family trajectories in particular. And then we see changes in social policy and tax reforms, such as welfare reform, as well as tax cuts, especially for the wealthy, which obviously have direct effects on wealth accumulation as well. And so taken together, these three trends, we assume that they mean adverse compositional life course change. Life courses that are less conducive to wealth accumulation for millennials, but also polarization in the wealth returns for the early millennials compared to the late baby boomers. So that's kind of our hypothesis. We test that using the NLSY, which is a very detailed longitudinal survey of two different birth cohorts in the United States. So the first birth cohort is known as the NLSY 79 because they were first interviewed in 1979. And these are essentially late baby boomers. So they were born between 1957 and 1964. And they've been interviewed annually throughout their lives, throughout their adult lives. And in our sample, we have 6,800 of them. And then the second cohort is what is known as the NLSY 1997. So these are millennials who were born between 1980 and 1984. So they are early millennials. And again, they have been followed from adulthood. And the sample that we have has about 6,000 millennials. So those are the two groups that we are comparing. We are comparing their wealth at the same age. Of course, it's very important because wealth obviously increases, generally speaking, with age. So we look at it at the same age, which means that it's comparable. And wealth is defined as the assets minus the debt of the respondents and their partner, if they have one. And it's obviously converted to 2018 US dollars to account for inflation. And also there's a top code of 600,000. And this is to protect the identity of very wealthy individuals in the data set. And the family and employment trajectories are based on monthly activity calendars. So we know what people were doing and what their family status was. And we use a method called sequence analysis, which I'll briefly introduce in a minute. And then we control for things like demographic characteristics like race, gender, as well as parental education. So this is what that cohort comparison looked like. So we follow these individuals from 18 to 35. So those are the gray shaded area. So obviously for the first 17 years, they were children. And then the light gray area, that's where we observe their family and career trajectory. So from age 18 to 34. And then we observe wealth at age 35, which is in the early 1990s for the baby boomers. And it's between 2015 and 2020 for the millennials. Of course, during this period, there were various historical events that might have affected their wealth accumulation, specifically economic shocks and recessions like the oil crisis in the case of the baby boomers. And for the millennials, of course, a very important one was the Great Recession of 2008. Which wiped out a lot of wealth and also obviously a lot of people lost their jobs. And then for the most recent birth year, also the COVID-19 pandemic. So we are asking, on the one hand, how do life course trajectories differ across cohorts? So that's where we use, we create clusters of typical employment and family trajectories based on sequence analysis. And we do that jointly for both cohorts. And then we look at how the wealth returns to life course trajectories differ across cohorts. So here we look at their equivalized inflation-adjusted wealth. And instead of using the mean, which is not a good summary measure for reasons that I've explained before, we look at different percentiles of the distribution using quantile regression. So we use the 10th percentile. So that is people at the lower end of the wealth distribution. The 50th percentile, which is the median, so that's people in the middle of the distribution, and then the 90th percentile, which is of the upper tail of the distribution instead of the mean. And we do that because, as you can see in this image, wealth is very unequally distributed. So here, the different quantiles, so this is people at the 10th percentile, the 0.5, that's people at the median, and 0.9, that's people at the 90th percentile. And we see that wealth is highly concentrated amongst the upper end of the distribution, right? So people at the 90th percentile, they have over 400,000 US dollars if they are millennials and about 350,000 if they're baby boomers. And people at the 10th percentile, they have essentially no wealth or even zero wealth in the case of millennials. And at the median, people have around 50,000. And so on the one hand, so the unequal distribution here is obviously something that's very striking. And on the other hand, we see some cohort differences, right? So we see that even though it's unequal, it has essentially become even more unequal in the sense that the poorest millennials, they have less than the poorest baby boomers at the same age. But the wealthiest millennials, they have more wealth than the wealthiest baby boomers at the same age. And at the median, we see that baby boomers were slightly wealthier than millennials. So the main story, I think, in this graph is increasing inequality in wealth across cohorts. And if we look at the different components that constitute wealth, we see that the change here is primarily in, well, it's actually in all of them, but it's in home equity. So whether people have equity in their own home, which is true for a larger number of baby boomers, simply because baby boomers were more likely to own their own home at 35. So especially at the median, most baby boomers have some housing wealth, but millennials at the median do not. On the other hand, millennials, especially at the top of their distribution, are more likely to have financial assets, and also very striking, they are much more likely to hold debts. So a lot of millennials at the lower end of the distribution have quite a lot of debt, which obviously has to do with study loans for higher education, but also things like credit card debt and so on. So that is, those four components together make up people's overall wealth. And when we look at work-life courses, we conceive of them as sequences. So if you think of someone's career trajectory, you can think of it as a sequence of different jobs, right? Or a sequence of different career stages. So for example, someone could be in college and then maybe get a temporary job, and eventually they get a sort of a professional job as a teacher or a doctor. Or some people, they might have some phases of unemployment interspersed in their career. So you can essentially see it as a sequence of different jobs or different career phases. And we have coded them according to the different classes that jobs can be allocated to using Goldthorpe's class scheme. So the higher professionals, those tend to be the most prestigious professions like lawyers and doctors. And then it goes sort of down to low-skilled service workers. And then the same for manual workers. So we have technicians who tend to be more highly paid, and going down to unskilled manual workers. And so for each respondent, we constituted their career as a sequence, and the same for their family life courses. So here, the different stages are things like living in a parental home with or without children, being single with or without children, cohabiting with a partner, again, with or without children, and being married or separated, again, with or without children. So again, each respondent has a family sequence and an employment sequence. And then if we put all those respondents together, we can visualize them like this. And we can cluster them as well. So for the employment or work-life courses, we see 10 different clusters. So the clusters broadly align with the classes themselves. So we have a cluster of higher professionals, a cluster of lower professionals, a cluster of unskilled manual workers who often also had some time in unemployment. And then we have a cluster of mixed low skills. So these were people who shifted between low-paid service jobs and unskilled manual work. And there's also a cluster of people who predominantly were out of the labor force, so they were not working. And then if we look at how those clusters or those typical life course trajectories changed across cohorts, we see some quite interesting patterns. So we see, for example, that the cluster of higher professionals was much less common among millennials than it was among baby boomers. So only about 8% of millennials were in that cluster compared to about 17% of baby boomers. On the other hand, the lower professionals cluster that increased a lot among millennials. And similarly, the technicians cluster. So this could be, for example, IT professionals. We also see quite a strong increase there. So quite a lot of compositional shifts. Similarly, for the family life courses, we see that we have 8 clusters. So, for example, early marriage, childless marriage, clusters characterized by singlehood or divorce. And again, here we see quite a lot of change across cohorts. So basically, clusters based around marriage becoming much less common among millennials. Unmarried parenthood clusters, on the other hand, increased a lot, as well as clusters characterized by singlehood and parental home. So this is kind of in line with what we know about millennials, right? So they're much less likely to marry. They stay in a parental home longer, and they stay single for longer. And so then the final question, and perhaps the crucial question of the paper is, how do these clusters relate to wealth in each cohort? So there we created this big graph. So here we see at the 10th percentile, at the 50th percentile, and at the 90th percentile, what were the wealth outcomes in each cohort by cluster or by work and family trajectory. So the top 3 images show the employment clusters, where the blue dots are the baby boomers and the red dots are the millennials. And the lines are essentially the confidence intervals of the predictions. So we see that at the 10th percentile, so these are among the poorer individuals in each cohort, that the millennials were much poorer than the poorest baby boomers, and especially a lot of them were in debt, even if they had a relatively prestigious career. So this probably has to do with the kind of debt that they still had at 35 from their studies. On the other hand, we see that when we look at the 90th percentile, so the wealthiest individuals in each cohort, here we see that millennials had quite a bit more wealth, especially if they were in these prestigious career trajectories like higher professionals. So it's very much a story of those who were already at the top of the distribution and in the most prestigious careers becoming even more wealthy, whereas those at the bottom doing worse. And a similar story basically for the bottom 3 images, which show the family trajectories. So here we see that people in what are typically called like sort of middle class family trajectories, like late marriage, getting married and having children quite late, and also childless marriages. Those people tended to increase their wealth, especially at the top of the distribution. But people who remain single essentially all the different trajectories are doing worse at the bottom of the distribution. So again, we see a pattern of increasing inequality there. So what is the key takeouts from this paper? So first of all, we see that wealth varies a lot by cohort as well as across the distribution. So we see that the poorest millennials are poorer than the poorest baby boomers, but the richest millennials are richer than the richest baby boomers. So increase in wealth inequality across cohorts. We also see that millennials' typical life courses differ substantially from the baby boomers. There's a shift from higher to lower professional careers, as well as to low-skilled service jobs and technicians. We also see a shift from marriage-based trajectories to trajectories based on having children within cohabitation, singlehood, as well as staying in the parental home longer. And we see a polarization in wealth returns between the middle class and the working class trajectories. And that's probably the main takeout from this paper, that the returns to already advantaged trajectories like professionals and technicians increased, but for those in service class and manual jobs, they are more likely to experience lower wealth or even indebtedness. So there is a polarization, not just in the wealth itself, but also in the returns to different employment and family trajectories. So those who were in middle class trajectories are generally doing better if they are millennials compared to baby boomers, but those in working class trajectories are doing worse. And that's why we say that this question that I asked in the beginning of the presentation about, which generation is worse off is actually a bit of a misleading question, because it assumes that there is a typical experience of each generation that can be summarized in the form of a mean, for example, or an overall statement about that generation. But actually what is going on is that there are huge discrepancies within each generation, and those discrepancies have increased over time. So if we compare millennials to baby boomers, we should really be asking which millennials are doing better and which millennials are doing worse than baby boomers at the same age. So there are obviously millennials who are doing very well, and we can think of very famous examples like Mark Zuckerberg or Sam Altman, both of whom are millennials. But many others are struggling, especially the ones in sort of working class career trajectories. So we need to change, I think we need to change the framing of this question and move away from sort of statements that generalize across generations to much more precise statements that focus on different groups within those generations and that acknowledge the increase in inequality that has been happening. Then we also make some broad policy recommendations. So yeah, of course, in the US, inequality is already very high, economic inequality, and it is increasing. So the polarization, not just of wealth, but also of people's actual family and employment lives is increasing, which has all sorts of negative impacts on societies, on society. And potential ways of addressing that. So we can essentially think of two types of policy interventions. So the one type would be policies that lift the bottom. So they focus on increasing wealth among people who currently have very little wealth or who even have negative wealth. And this relates to policies like labor laws, so things like the minimum wage or getting people into jobs, but also housing policies and healthcare, right? So healthcare costs is one of the main reasons why people become indebted in the United States. So universal healthcare coverage. And then the other set of policies would be policies that level the top. So they decrease the wealth or stabilize the wealth at the upper end of the distribution. And here you can think about policies like a wealth tax, but also things like inheritance tax, because a lot of wealth doesn't necessarily come from income, but it's essentially bequests, right? So people hand over wealth to their children. So yeah, so we suggest that a combination of those two kinds of policies might go some way towards addressing the negative consequences of the phenomenon that we have just shown in this paper. So just before I close, I just wanted to share some of the news items that resulted from this paper. So because it's such a popular question, right, because it appeals to people's their own experiences, and it's something that people are already talking about on social media and in the news. So when we released this paper, it got quite a lot of attention, especially in the US. So USA Today picked it up, and Fox News and various other media outlets. So unfortunately, they again went with this framing of, which generation is better off than worse off, whereas our whole argument was around we should move away from that framing. But still, I think it's good to see that they were engaging with empirical research and academic findings. So we were quite happy about that. Yeah, so thank you for listening in, and here are my contact details if you want to get in touch, but also very happy to answer any questions, or if you have any comments on the paper, I'd be very happy to hear them as well.
Fabulous, Rob. A really great data set to work with. You must have really enjoyed this project. There's so much at stake here, isn't there? I think it is possible to ask the general question. I mean, it depends what values, of course, you place on different modes of life. And once you answer that question, you can then make an assessment about the difference between the generations. So if you think that an even more even sort of society is attractive to you, then yes, the baby boomers were better off. If you think opportunities for high wealth are attractive to you, then the millennials are better off. But I mean, I would say that if you think a stable life is more attractive to you and a precarious high risk universe is less attractive, then it's clear cut. I mean, this is the millennial universe is more of a winner take all universe.
Yeah.
You know, it functions more like a positional market in the classic sense, you know, with limited number of high value options and a large number of people who miss out altogether. I mean, those figures on debt and on home ownership and so on all play into that too. It's not just a matter of income and wealth. It's also the, you know, the character of life, the fact that without a home and with debt, your existence is more uncertain, more in control of others, and more precarious in a number
Yeah.
of ways. So, you know, it's powerful. And yeah, the baby boomers like me were lucky, weren't they? It was in a lot of ways, you could have a moderate expectation of a moderately successful life, rather than a low expectation of a rich life. And for many of us anyway, especially those of us who've chosen to work in the public sector because it provides that stability at a moderate level rather than, you know, the high income earning opportunities of the private sector. You know, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are all very good points. Yeah. Yeah, I guess you can debate whether the trend that we observe is a desirable trend or not, right? I think most people would probably agree that that it's undesirable and that inequality is too high, and that the fact that it continues to increase is probably worrying. Yeah, and especially because of what you just mentioned, right? That wealth is it has a very important insurance function. So it has obviously a function in the sense that you can convert it into items that people want, but it's also a source of security, right? Especially in the US, where you do not have a very strong welfare state, and where, you know, if you do not have wealth and you, especially if you do not have health insurance and an accident happens to you, you will not be able to pay for treatment. So yeah, it's a kind of buffer. It's a kind of also a source of psychological security and that is obviously why it's such a valued outcome, right? There's almost nobody who wouldn't say that they would not rather have more wealth rather than less.
Let me ask a couple of questions before we start inviting members of the audience, because I'm going to pick people if I don't get some more questions in the chat. First, do we know anything about what happens after this? Do we have any data yet on, you know, the 45s, the 50-year-old points, the further?
Well, the millennials, they are not old enough yet. So this would literally
No.
be in the future. So the oldest millennials would be people born in 1980. So they would now be 40. In 1980, they would now be 43, right? So, and the youngest ones, they are now sort of turning around 35. So that would be a question for the future, how this will play out. Will they catch up eventually, or will this trend continue to worsen? So we can trace it because the analysis Y is ongoing. So we can continue to follow them as they age, and potentially we can, you know, do a follow-up study in 5 or 10 years time. For the baby boomers, of course, we do know how their lives play out because they have reached that age now, and we can follow them in the analysis Y, and we can see that their wealth essentially continues to increase over time. But whether the millennials will follow a similar trajectory where they, as they age, they start to accumulate significantly more wealth, that is simply too early to tell.
Let me ask you one more. What about the role of higher education? We do run a webinar series focused on higher education, so
yes.
I should introduce those words at this point.
Yeah.
Go on. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. So obviously, millennials are more likely to have higher educational qualifications than baby boomers, right? Which in a way is striking. So you would expect that to enable them to accumulate more wealth, but it obviously didn't. Which doesn't mean that it didn't benefit them. So as we have seen, there is of course a huge discrepancy in wealth between what we call people in sort of middle class trajectories and people in working class trajectories. And obviously, the thing that enables people to enter into middle class trajectories is often higher education. So I do think we see a polarization between people who do have advanced degrees and people who don't.
Yeah.
And of course, that plays out in other dimensions of society as well, in terms of people's political views. I think there is a similar polarization between people with and without degrees going on.
Yes.
And then I guess the third thing where it plays out is that when we look at the indebtedness figures, I think that was quite striking that millennials are much more likely to be indebted, even the ones that have good jobs and that have
Yeah.
otherwise highly paid careers, even at 35, essentially a lot of them haven't finished paying off their debts that they incurred from their from studying. And for baby boomers, that was obviously not the case.
But of course, a lot less of the baby boomers went through higher education or went through advanced degrees.
Yeah.
I mean, the level of participation in the US reached 50% in the early 70s.
Yeah.
It's now, in tertiary participation rates more like 86%, I think, in the last count. So,
Yeah.
it's the millennials that have really been the more educated generation.
Yeah, I think what's also very striking in the US, which we don't really have so much, I think, in Europe, is the some college category. So people who maybe went to college and then dropped out after 2 years, so they didn't get like the actual bachelor's degree, but maybe they get a community college degree or a partial degree. And those people, they are obviously often not from particularly privileged backgrounds. And I think many of them, I mean, we'd have to look at the exact data, but I think many of them end up in less prestigious employment trajectories compared to, so the ones who are really benefiting, the ones who are really doing well, those tend to be probably people who have degrees from good universities, a smooth transition into the labor market and so on. Yeah.
I was really struck too by the way in which the job profile, the occupational profile has changed, and in particular the reduction in the number of people in reduction in the proportion of people in high professional jobs, and this and the large increase among the millennials in the proportion who are in the sort of lesser professional and skilled jobs, and it seems to indicate that hollowing out of the middle of the occupational structure, which some people have talked about, isn't happening. That, in fact, that sort of middle and upper middle area of the labour market's been quite substantially growing in terms of the nature of the work that people are doing, and it's that top end that is shrinking, not the middle. And so you have a situation where a lot of people with tertiary qualifications are now heading to lower echelon jobs than they would have headed to in the previous generation.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. We were also quite struck by this. So we even went back to the data, the raw data, to see if it wasn't some sort of issue with our coding or how we did the analysis. But even if you just look at the raw data, there's really striking difference in the number of people in these sort of like, the most prestigious jobs, right? Lawyers, doctors, professors, and so on. I mean, it's only until 35, so it could be that it's a pattern of delayed entry where people might still eventually get promoted into those jobs, and maybe baby boomers were able to start those jobs earlier in their careers. So that might be part of the explanation. But I mean, it's a huge drop. So, and at the same time, like you said, we see an increase in those like still relatively prestigious jobs, so lower professionals. So this would be people like teachers, administrative staff and so on, as well as technicians. So these people like, that's a bit of a mixed bag. So it could be police officers, but also chefs and IT professionals, but like people who work more with their hands. That increased also quite a lot. And some of those people are actually quite highly paid as well. But at the same time, we see that the lower service sector, that has increased a lot as well. And that is very much in line with what we know, that is the sector that's growing a lot in the US. And those people are obviously in quite precarious jobs, most of them.
Well, I mean, if looking at this, I'd say that what we know about the 50s, 60s, 70s in the US was that was a period when there was tremendous growth in the professional categories, particularly public sector employment for a while. and that continues into the 80s. It might have caught some of those baby boomers have benefited from the tail end of that growth in the professional category relative to the labour market as a whole, and were promoted earlier. Were promoted earlier than the millennials were. So people coming into, yes, good jobs, senior positions in their 30s was not unheard of at all. It was harder later. The baby boomers occupied those spots. They created millennials.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important, like you mentioned, to continue sort of tracking them and see, like in 10 years' time, how the picture has changed. When obviously, like now is around the time a lot of those baby boomers are retiring. So
yes, that opens
potentially
up
those
opportunities.
positions become available. And obviously, baby boomers were a very large cohort, right? That's why they're called the baby boomers. And we're now seeing actually shortages across the board, right? In the US, also in senior occupations in the UK as well. In the Netherlands, where I'm from, like companies having a really hard time finding workers because, the older generations are retiring, and the younger generations are simply smaller because people are having fewer kids.
Well, there has to be spaces to move into, doesn't there? And the sort of argument that Piketty makes about, the growth of equality after World War II was that the Depression emptied and the war emptied out so many private fortunes, and that created space in if you like, in the wealth and income structure for upward mobility on a much larger scale. Once having achieved that upward mobility, once those echelons were occupied, it's a bit like, evolution. Once the evolutionary location is occupied, then no one else is going to come along and take that niche. And it's a bit like that with wealth and income, except of course, eventually, as you say, people pass through, they get older, and gaps then start to open up. So presumably the millennials have suffered from the baby boomers, as point is, which is often made, of course, and the generation after the millennials might have better opportunities than the millennials.
Yeah, I think what some economists are showing now that actually since COVID, so very recently, so this would be too recent for our paper to pick up, but because the labor market has been so tight, there's been a scarcity of workers in the US, has actually benefited people in low-paid jobs, and their wages have actually increased quite a lot, to the point that it's actually led to quite a significant reduction in wage inequality because of those companies having a shortage of workers, so they have to pay workers more, especially those who are on low wages. So their negotiating position has improved because of the scarcity of workers. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Labour shortages are playing out in various countries in different ways, depending on the demographics at the moment. Now I'll bring in my colleague Vincent Carpentier from University College London. Vincent, please feel free to have a conversation at this point. We've not got a lot of people occupying the chat, and you do know these issues, so you're welcome to ask more than one question.
Hello everyone. Many thanks, Rob. Really enjoy the talk. I've got a question. First, I think there are fascinating findings, and I'm going maybe to go in. I had a key question about the role of higher education policies, and you already touched on this, and I wanted to ask maybe something more specific about the differentiation in higher education, whether you could find the effect of the stratification of higher education access, and to which extent, that could explain as well the, what clearly you describe as an increase of inequality within the second generation you looked at. And my other question is about which you talked about already, but is the comparative aspect. Are there countries where, from the literature review you've done or other studies you looked at, where you would have different results or less striking than the US? And after space, question of time, how do you see this, the policy you mentioned at the end? At the moment, there's a lot of debates of whether they're going to happen or not, and doesn't look like it at the moment. So how do you see things?
No, I think Biden has so far, he hasn't introduced a wealth tax yet. I think also in the US, these policies would be very radical, right? So even talking about a wealth tax is sort of considered like a extreme far left idea. I think even I'm not even sure Bernie Sanders had it in his program.
Great country, isn't it?
Yeah. But yeah, I think your questions are very very relevant. So yeah, whether we've looked at the stratification of access to higher education, not in this paper, but I think it's something that could potentially be done with the NLSY data because it has just so much information on each individual, including probably where they went to university and what they studied. So the focus of this paper was not so much on looking at the returns to higher education, but of course, it would be very interesting to see how the career trajectories and then eventually the wealth accumulation of people who went to different types of university and who studied different things, how that played out, right? And of course, in the US, there is a huge stratification in higher education, like I mentioned, from community colleges to state universities to like Ivy League. And I think you probably have enough of a sample size to look at how trajectories vary between those groups. And obviously, you will find that people who went to Ivy League will have higher wealth. I have no doubts about it. But to what extent that is mediated by their career trajectories and so on, that would be quite interesting. Yeah, I think it can be done with the data, but it's not something that we have done. The second question on the comparative dimension, again, it's unfortunately not something that we have done. It is something that we were sort of thinking about, like if you were to do this in the UK or in other Western countries, how would it look like? The problem is that the data requirements are, of course, very high, right?
Yeah.
So you would need longitudinal data that follow people throughout their careers in different cohorts. And this is extremely rare. You might be able to do something like with the cohort studies in the UK. You have the well, the millennial cohort, they wouldn't be old enough yet. So maybe in 20 years time, you could do something like that. Otherwise, you could maybe use some retrospective data, but that's obviously much less reliable and less detailed than prospective data where you actually interview people every year. But yeah, it would be interesting to see if we were to be able to do this kind of analysis for the UK or Germany, whether we would find different results. I would probably assume that for the UK it would be similar, but again, it's not something that I've looked into. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Thank you.
if you come from the Netherlands, I'm sure you've thought about these comparisons. And it's isn't it interesting to think about what's distinctive about the US context? And I mean, what's distinctive includes, I guess, the level of student indebtedness. You know, that factor doesn't play out in the same way in Western Europe. It's beginning to in the UK in a different sense because the income contingent loan system does operate differently to mortgage style debt, and its impact on people's financial and perhaps their effective position. But nonetheless, Western Europe different to the US in that regard. And I suppose housing patterns are going to be different in some cases. It's easier to own a home in some West European countries than in the US. But of course, it's so regional in the US, isn't it? I remember going to the University of Purdue and at one stage to give a talk and meeting a colleague there that I used to work with in Australia, and she took me to her home and showed me her home and said it had only cost them $90,000 a couple of years before. And I thought, huh? You know, it's this nice modern 3-bedroom home on a reasonably large size block of land, and it was only 90,000. But it's not like that in San Francisco. So, you know, it does depend where you are. And I suppose also family structures. I mean, that's hard, particularly sort of thorny one to try and track, I know, but I suspect those patterns of marriage and childbearing are not going to play out exactly the same everywhere either. So even apart from the wealth and income and the occupational structure questions, those other elements could well be differentiating the US from the rest. But it's this is a great data set because you've got so much. I mean, you haven't done higher education, but you've got so much else going on here. You've been able to draw in so many issues. Can I ask you a question about what you're going to do next? I mean, where do you go from here with this kind of work?
Well, so in a way, this project was a little bit unusual for me because, like I said, most of my current work is based on education in the global South. So which is quite different from this kind of, this is more classic sociology stratification research. So it's actually a project that resulted from a postdoc that I did, like 8 years ago. And since then, my research has kind of moved in quite a different direction. So now I'm mostly looking at learning assessment data like PISA, as well as like register data from various low and middle income countries. So personally, I am not continuing this line of work, but I think my co-authors, so Annette and Fazang and Zachary van Winkel, they are both very much still continuing this line of work, and they have published some very interesting things recently. So, for example, Annette has done one paper where she looked at how these things vary by race and gender. So that's are things that we kind of blend out a little bit in this paper. But obviously in the US, there are huge wealth gaps by race, but also potentially by gender. So for example, work trajectories and family trajectories vary hugely by gender. So she has a paper out that looks at those things in much more detail. Yeah, I can imagine that maybe in 10 years' time we'll do an update on this paper, but other than that, it's not something that we're currently working on. Yeah.
Yeah, I do hope you do. I think this is of great interest, and well, you could see from the media coverage that it's one of the few kinds of topics which can really cut through, into the public space so easily, and gets picked up by the serious and the mid-range media as well, both, which is fantastic, really.
Yeah.
And very good for your impact and public engagement profile in the School of Education at University.
I guess so, yeah.
Yeah. So everyone will encourage this, I'm sure. Colleagues, we don't have any further questions. Rob, is there anything else you wanted to tell us before we close?
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. If you do have questions later on, or if you want to get in touch, please do feel free to send me an email.
And let me invite you back on when you've got more things you want to tell us about the work that you're now doing. We really appreciate your contribution today. And, this is great research, really well expressed, and very nice slides, very clear. And this is the kind of thing which works very well for our format. So we'd really like to hear from you again, Rob. And good luck with your work in future.
Thank you so much.
Colleagues, our next webinar, as you can see, because Chris has already posted it in the chat, is called Working Class Professional Service and Administrative Staff in UK Higher Education, Reflections on Reward, Recognition and Responsibility. It's about professional staff and particular category of professional staff who come from lower income backgrounds. And it is followed then by a succession of 4 webinars, which are going to focus on the outcomes of our Research on Research project, which has been a 3-year project led by Alice Wanchar, a very good project in terms of a massive data collection, a lot of policy relevant stuff, comparative work across several countries on research, the role of research in higher education, research evaluation and assessment systems. And they've got a lot to say, and they're going to give it to us in successive webinars, a general one on the research project, which will be on Thursday the 18th, followed by a webinar on research assessment and impact on Tuesday the 23rd, and then a webinar on open science on Thursday the 25th, and then a book launch of the Bloomsbury Handbooks of Crisis and Transformative Leadership in Higher Education will then see out my time as CG Director at the end of April. But our next webinar, and it's all on our website, this information, our next webinar is next Tuesday with Jess Pilgrim-Brown on professional staff. Thanks, Rob, and we'll look forward to seeing you again, and look forward to seeing everyone again next Thursday at our webinar on professional staff. Bye for now.